One of the deadliest events in human history was set in motion by a government trying to save money. Tens of millions of people died. An empire of 150 million people, the richest state on earth, was helped into its grave by a budget cut that saved 685,000 taels of silver, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. In 1629, the Ming court shut down the network that carried its mail to trim a line in the budget. 15 years later, the last emperor was hanging from a tree behind his own palace, and one of the men who put him there had worked for the very department they cut. Tonight, you follow that decision down, through silver from a mine in the Andes. The worst drought in 1500 years, a forgotten rebel king, and 4 capitals running it today. This should be front-page news. It is not, and by the end you will understand why that should frighten you. So get comfortable and subscribe, or join if you have not. There is a Patreon where we go deeper into how complex systems die. Stay to the end, because the most disturbing part is not how the Ming fell. It is that you cannot tell from the inside whether your own government is making the same mistake. Let's go back to where this began. There is a number buried in the financial records of the Ming Dynasty that should be one of the most famous numbers in history, and almost nobody outside a small circle of specialists has ever heard it. The number is 685,000 taels of silver. That is roughly what a single government official calculated his department could save the imperial treasury by shutting down one piece of state infrastructure. On paper, it was a sensible cut. The infrastructure was bleeding money. It was being abused by officials who used it for private travel and personal errands. Trimming it back looked like exactly the kind of disciplined, responsible bookkeeping that a state in trouble is supposed to do. So the cut was approved, and 15 years later the dynasty that approved it was gone, the last emperor hanging by his own belt from a tree on the hill behind his palace, and one of the men who helped put him there had been, before the cut, an employee of the exact department that got shut down to save the money. This is not a metaphor, and it is not a stretch. The richest, largest, most administratively advanced state on the surface of the earth in the early 1600s was brought down, in part, by a cost-saving measure, an efficiency drive, a line item in a budget, an empire of roughly 150 million people, a state that had printed the world's first paper money and launched treasure fleets that reached the coast of Africa decades before Columbus ever left Spain, was helped into its grave by something that in a modern government would be called fiscal responsibility. And the reason this story matters, the reason I have not been able to stop thinking about it, is not that it happened once, a long time ago, in a place most people in the West could not find on a map. It is that the specific decision at the center of it, the exact category of decision, is being made right now in at least 4 capital cities by governments who would tell you with total sincerity that they are doing the responsible thing. The official story you have probably absorbed about the fall of the Ming, if you have absorbed any version of it at all, is that the dynasty collapsed because of the Manchus. Foreign invaders from the northeast, the people who would go on to found the Qing dynasty and rule China for the next 268 years. That story is not wrong. The Manchus did take Beijing. They did found the Qing. But they did it in the autumn of 1644, walking through a gate that was already open, into a capital where the Ming emperor was already dead, killed not by them, but by a peasant rebel army that had taken the city months earlier. The Manchus did not conquer the Ming. They arrived after the Ming had already destroyed itself, and they picked up what was lying on the ground. The invaders everyone remembers were the cleanup crew. So if the Manchus did not bring down the Ming, what did? And here is where every popular account starts to go soft and vague, because the honest answer is uncomfortable in a way that the foreign invasion story is not. The honest answer is that the Ming state made a series of choices under genuine pressure that each looked individually defensible, and that together accelerated the exact collapse they were meant to prevent. The choice at the heart of it, the one I want to walk you all the way through, is the decision to cut costs at the precise moment the system was least able to survive the cut. And the question I want you to hold in your head for the next 2.5 hours, the question this entire story is built around, is this: why does a government facing a crisis it can clearly see coming keep reaching for the one response that makes the crisis worse? And why, when it reaches for that response, does it feel to everyone in the room like wisdom? Because that is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Not that the Ming made a mistake. States make mistakes constantly. The disturbing part is that the people who made this particular decision were not stupid, were not lazy, were not uniquely corrupt by the standards of their time. They were doing the thing that careful, sober, responsible administrators are supposed to do when the money runs out. They cut. And the cutting is what killed them. Let me show you the machine they cut, because you cannot feel the weight of what happened until you understand what the thing actually was. The Ming, like the dynasties before it, ran an empire-spanning network of relay stations. The Chinese word is yi. Picture a chain of way stations spread across the entire territory of China, each one roughly 60 li from the next, which is something like 20 miles. Each one staffed with men and stocked with horses, boats, food, and beds. Their job was to move the empire's information and the empire's people. An official courier carrying an urgent military dispatch from the northwest frontier to the capital did not ride a single exhausted horse the whole way. He rode hard to the next station, handed off, took a fresh horse, and kept going, while the message moved across the country at a speed that would not be matched again in that part of the world for centuries. One historian called this network the arteries and veins of the empire, and that is not a poetic flourish, it is a structural description. The relay system was how the brain of the state stayed connected to the body. It was how Beijing learned that a province was in revolt, how armies received their orders, how tax silver and grain moved, how the whole vast apparatus of a continental empire kept from flying apart under its own size. To understand how radical that was, you have to remember what the alternative was. In a world before the telegraph, before the railway, before any of the technologies we use to collapse distance, information could move no faster than a human being could carry it, and a human being carrying it alone, on one horse, over the enormous distances of China, would arrive exhausted, days or weeks late, on an animal half dead. The relay system defeated that limit by brute organization, by staging fresh horses and fresh riders every 20 miles or so across thousands of miles of territory. It let a single urgent message travel at the speed of a continuous gallop, station to station, day and night, in a way no individual rider could ever sustain. At its height, the network ran to well over 1,000 stations, supported by hundreds of thousands of horses and an army of grooms, clerks, boatmen, and couriers, with water relays on the rivers and canals to carry what the roads could not. It was, in a real sense, the closest thing the pre-modern world had to a nervous system operating at scale. A standing institution whose entire purpose was to keep a country the size of a continent aware of itself. A famine in one province, a mutiny in another, a Manchu raid across the northern border. All of it reached the capital through these arteries, and all of the capital's responses flowed back out through them. Cut the arteries, and the body does not die immediately. It dies the way a body dies, when it can no longer feel its own extremities, when the brain stops receiving word of what is happening at the edges until the edges are already gone. And the abuse that made the system look like waste, the officials riding the relay horses for private pleasure trips and billing the state for lavish lodging they had no right to, was real, and it was exactly the kind of visible, irritating, documentable abuse that makes a reformer feel righteous about cutting the whole thing, without ever asking what the whole thing was actually doing while the abusers were busy abusing it. By the late Ming, this network had become enormous, and like any large old institution, it had become expensive and abused. Officials with the right connections used the relay horses and the relay lodgings for personal travel they had no right to. The stations were staffed by tens of thousands of men, the couriers and station hands and grooms, many of them paid in silver, men whose entire livelihood, whose family's survival, depended on those wages. And in the late 1620s, with the treasury nearly empty and complaints about post-station abuse piling up, the imperial court started to look at this sprawling, leaky, costly network the way a desperate finance ministry looks at any large recurring expense. They started to see it not as the nervous system of the state, but as a budget problem. The man whose name is attached to the cut is an official called Lu Mao. The impulse to do something about the relay system came to a head in 1628, the first year of the reign of the new young emperor, when censors complained loudly about the abuses. The formal proposal to gut the system was enacted in the 4th month of 1629, after which Lu Mao was moved into an office of military affairs to administer the retrenchment he had argued for. And by the 2nd month of 1631, he was able to report the savings. Across the provinces, his accounting showed combined reductions of 685,000 taels and change. There it was, a real, countable number, proof that the cut had worked, that the discipline had paid off, that the responsible thing had produced a responsible result. I want you to sit with how reasonable that must have felt. A government drowning in costs it cannot meet identifies a bloated, abused, expensive program. It trims that program. It produces a hard number, showing money saved. Every incentive in the building rewards the official who found the savings. Nobody in that room is thinking about what happens to the tens of thousands of men who just lost their jobs, because those men are not a line in the ledger. The savings are the line in the ledger. And this is the first thing I need you to understand before we go any deeper, because it is the thread that runs through this entire story and out the other side into your own century. The most dangerous policy a fragile state can adopt is almost never the one that looks reckless. It is the one that looks like maturity. The cut that killed the Ming did not arrive dressed as a catastrophe. It arrived dressed as good governance. It arrived as the adult in the room. 685,000 taels. Hold that figure, because we are going to come back to it at the end and weigh it against what it actually bought. And the comparison is going to be one of the most damning things in this entire story. For now, just notice the shape of the thing. A government under pressure, a visible defensible cut, a clean number showing success, and underneath it, invisible to everyone signing off, tens of thousands of newly unemployed men scattered across the provinces that were about to become the epicenter of the worst catastrophe China had seen in over 1,000 years. But to understand why a sane and sophisticated government found itself this desperate enough to start amputating its own nervous system to save money, you have to understand how the wealthiest empire on earth had managed to go broke. And the answer to that is a story about silver, about a metal the Ming could not produce, could not control, and had nevertheless made the foundation of its entire fiscal existence. The Ming did not just run out of money. The Ming had quietly bet its survival on something that was about to be taken away from it by events on the other side of the planet, in minds its rulers had never seen, in countries most of them did not know existed. To see how the trap was built, you have to go back about 50 years before the cut, to a reform that almost everyone at the time considered a triumph. In the 1570s and into the 1580s, under a brilliant and ruthless Grand Secretary named Zhang Zhuzheng, the Ming overhauled the way it collected taxes. The reform is usually called the single whip, and the idea behind it was genuinely elegant. For centuries, the Ming tax system had been a nightmare of complexity. There were separate land taxes, separate poll taxes, and labor obligations where the state could simply conscript a peasant to dig a canal or haul grain or serve in a relay station for a stretch of unpaid work. Different obligations were owed at different times to different officials in different forms, some in grain, some in cloth, some in bodies. It was chaotic, it was easy to cheat, and it was almost impossible to audit. The single whip swept most of that away and replaced it with one consolidated payment, one assessment owed in one form on a regular schedule. And the form it standardized on was silver. Instead of handing over grain or weeks of forced labor, the taxpayer increasingly handed over a measured weight of silver. From the standpoint of an administrator in 1580, this was modernization in its purest sense. It simplified the code, it made revenue predictable, it made corruption harder to hide. Zhang Zhuzheng died in 1582, and within a few years his memory was being dragged through the mud by political enemies, but his tax reform survived him and spread across the empire because, by the metrics any treasury cares about, it worked. Here is what nobody building that system seems to have fully reckoned with. China did not produce much silver. The empire had monetized its entire fiscal life, had made silver the substance in which the state's survival was denominated, and it could not dig that substance out of its own ground in anything like the quantities it now needed. So where did the silver come from? It came from outside. It came across the oceans. And this is the moment the Ming, without anyone deciding it as a matter of strategy, tied the stability of the largest empire on earth to mines on the far side of the planet that it did not own, could not defend, and in most cases did not even know the location of. Two great rivers of silver flowed into China across the late 16th and early 17th centuries. One came from Japan, from mines like the vast Iwami Ginzan complex, carried by Portuguese and Chinese and eventually Dutch traders into the ports of the South China coast. The other came from the Americas, from the Spanish mines, above all from a single mountain of silver at Potosi in what is now Bolivia, one of the richest ore deposits ever found by any civilization. Spanish silver crossed the Pacific in the great galleons that ran between Acapulco on the coast of Mexico and Manila in the Philippines, where it was traded to Chinese merchants for silk and porcelain and then carried into China. A smaller but real stream also came the long way, across the Atlantic to Spain and then eastward. The scale of this is hard to hold in your head, so let me try to make it concrete. Estimates of how much silver entered China in the century or so before the dynasty fell vary enormously between scholars, and we are going to deal with that disagreement honestly in a moment, because it matters. But by the higher commonly cited figures, something on the order of 7,000 tons of silver flowed into China in that window. 7,000 tons of a precious metal, pouring into one country from two continents. Because that country had built a tax system that demanded silver and a manufacturing economy the rest of the world could not get enough of. Spanish and Portuguese observers in the Manila of the 1630s had a phrase for the intensity of Chinese demand for the metal. They said silver was blood. They watched it flow out of Spanish hands and into Chinese ones, and they understood, in a way the Ming court arguably did not, that they were feeding the circulatory system of a foreign empire. I want to follow that silver back to where it came from for a moment, because the supply chain that the Ming had quietly made itself dependent on is one of the strangest and darkest in all of economic history, and most people who owed their taxes in silver had no idea any of it existed. A great deal of the American silver came from a single mountain in the high Andes, the Cerro Rico, the rich hill that towered over the town of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, at an altitude where the air is thin enough to make breathing hard. The Spanish worked that mountain with a system of forced indigenous labor, a rotational draft that pulled men from their communities and sent them into the dark of the shafts under conditions so lethal that Potosi became a byword for death. The silver those men dug out at the cost of their lives was minted into coins, the famous pieces of 8, and those coins became, in effect, the first truly global currency, accepted from Seville to Manila to the markets of southern China. So, the tax a Chinese peasant paid in a dusty village in Shanxi was, at the far end of an invisible chain stretching halfway around the planet, connected to a man dying in a mine shaft in the Andes. The stability of the Ming rested, without the Ming ever quite deciding it should, on the output of mines it did not own, worked by people it had never heard of, shipped across an ocean by powers it did not control, and the day those distant flows faltered, the consequences would land on peasants who could not have found Bolivia on a map and had no notion that their fate was tied to it. This is what it means to denominate your survival in something you cannot produce. You hand the fate of your state to events that happen entirely outside it, to decisions made by foreigners for reasons of their own, and you do not even feel the dependency until the moment it turns against you, at which point it is far too late to build the domestic supply you spent a century deciding you did not need. And then the blood supply was cut. In the late 1630s, two things happened at once, on opposite sides of the world, that throttled the flow of silver into China at the worst conceivable moment. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate, the regime that had unified the country, issued a series of edicts between 1633 and 1639 that are usually grouped under the name Sakoku, the closed country. The Tokugawa were terrified of foreign influence, especially of Christianity, and they slammed the door on most foreign trade and most foreign contact. Trade through the port of Nagasaki never fully stopped, and I want to be precise about that, because the popular version overstates the closure. But the great age of Japanese silver flowing freely into Chinese commerce was ending, and Japan's own richest mines were beginning to play out. At the same time, the silver coming from the Spanish Americas contracted as well, as the colonial economy ran into its own troubles and the volume moving through the Pacific routes fell. Now think about what that does to a society that owes its taxes in silver. When silver becomes scarce, silver becomes more valuable. And when silver becomes more valuable, the real burden of any debt denominated in silver goes up, even if the nominal amount you owe has not changed by a single coin. The peasant in a northern Chinese village did not earn silver. He earned, when he earned anything, copper coins, the small change of daily life. He grew grain, he sold a little of it for copper. And then when the tax collector came, he had to convert that copper into the silver the state demanded. And the rate at which copper traded for silver moved against him brutally. In the early 1630s, a string of 1,000 copper coins might buy you an ounce of silver. By 1643, that same string of 1,000 coins was worth something closer to 1/3 of an ounce. The tax bill, measured in silver, stayed the same on paper, but the amount of actual labor, actual grain, actual life a peasant had to surrender to produce that silver had roughly tripled. The state was, in effect, raising taxes massively on its poorest and most desperate subjects without passing a single new tax, simply by continuing to demand payment in a metal that was vanishing from circulation. This is the silver trap, and it is the reason the treasury was empty enough to start eyeing the relay system. The Ming had built its revenue on a foreign metal. The foreign metal stopped arriving, and the entire fiscal structure began to seize up. Tax revenue in real terms collapsed in exactly the regions least able to pay, while the state's expenses, above all the cost of fighting the Manchus on the northern frontier, kept climbing. The court was caught between a revenue base that was failing and a war it could not afford to lose, and into that gap it poured emergency surtaxes on a peasantry that was already being crushed by the silver squeeze. It was a vise, and the court was tightening both jaws at once. Now I have to stop and be honest with you, because this is the point where a lazier version of this story would lie to you by leaving something out, and you deserve better than that. The silver story I have just told you is contested among the historians who study this most carefully, and the disagreement is real and unresolved. The strongest version of the silver argument was made by the historian William Atwell, who argued that the contraction of silver imports was a central trigger of a wider 17th century crisis that brought the Ming down. But one of the most formidable economic historians of Ming China, Richard von Glan, has pushed back hard on the simplest form of that claim, and his objections are not trivial. By his own calculations, the late 1630s did see imports fall, but the size of the shortfall, measured against the enormous quantity of silver that had already entered China over the previous century, was relatively modest, on the order of a few percent of the accumulated stock. And here is his sharpest point. If China were really suffering a pure silver shortage, a monetary contraction, you would expect prices to fall, because money would be scarce and goods plentiful. Instead, grain prices in the famine years did not fall, they soared. That is the signature of a food catastrophe, not a money one. Von Glan's verdict is that the late Ming monetary trouble was real, but was driven more by failures of the state's own monetary policy than by a global silver drought, and that it was a shorter and shallower thing than the dramatic version suggests. I find this genuinely difficult, and I am not going to pretend to resolve a debate that people who have spent their careers in the Ming archives have not resolved. But notice what both sides actually agree on, because the agreement is more important than the dispute for our purposes. Everyone in this argument accepts that the tax system was rigid and denominated in silver. Everyone accepts that in the poorly monetized regions of the north, silver was scarce and dear, and the real burden on peasants rose. Everyone accepts that the state was fiscally cornered. The debate is about how much of the cornering to blame on global silver flows versus domestic monetary mismanagement versus the catastrophe we are about to get to. And from where the peasant stood, in a failing village in a dying province, the bookkeeping of blame did not matter at all. What mattered was that the silver he owed had become impossibly expensive to obtain. The state kept demanding it anyway, and the men who ran the state treated this as a problem of accounting rather than a problem of survival. That is the abdication I want you to start watching for, because it recurs all the way through this story, and it recurs in the modern half of it too. The people who should have understood what they were looking at. The officials with the training and the records and the authority looked at a society coming apart under a monetary squeeze and a tax burden it could not bear, and they reached for the tools of a treasury clerk. More surtaxes here. A savings of 685,000 taels there. They optimized the ledger. They were not evil, and many of them were not even incompetent. They simply could not see the thing they were standing inside of, because the thing they were standing inside of did not look like a catastrophe from the inside. It looked like a series of difficult but responsible decisions about money. A fiscally cornered empire is dangerous, but it is not necessarily doomed. States have survived being broke. What turns a fiscal crisis into the end of a 400-year dynasty is when the broke empire gets hit, at the same moment, by something its accountants have no tools for at all. And that is what happened. Because at the exact moment the silver was drying up and the taxes were becoming unpayable, the sky over northern China did something it had not done in something like 1500 years. The rain stopped, and it did not start again for the better part of 2 decades. When people in the West hear the phrase Little Ice Age, they tend to picture something almost charming. Frost fairs on a frozen River Thames, Peter Bruegel paintings of skaters and hunters in the snow, a bit of European cold, a few hard winters, nothing that sounds like the end of a world. That is the sanitized version, and it is sanitized partly because it is told from the perspective of the places that survived it best. In northern China, the same global cooling expressed itself not as a picturesque frost, but as the most severe drought that part of the world had experienced in roughly 1500 years. Not the worst in living memory, not the worst in a few centuries, the worst since before the Tang Dynasty existed, the worst in a span of time that reaches back past the fall of Rome. Climate historians working from tree rings and historical records have reconstructed this event in detail, and it has a name: the Chongzhen Drought, after the emperor on whose watch it fell. Its early phase concentrated in the provinces of Shaanxi and Shaanxi in the late 1620s and early 1630s. Then it spread and deepened, reaching a peak between 1638 and 1641, when in places, even stretches of the Yellow River are recorded running dry. And I want you to notice where it started, because the geography is not incidental. It is the whole tragedy in a single fact. It started in the northwest. Shaanxi, the poor, dry, hard-bitten frontier provinces where silver was scarcest, where the tax squeeze bit deepest, and where, as it happens, the relay stations that had just been cut were thickest. Because the northwest was the frontier, and the frontier was where the empire most needed to move its couriers and its soldiers. So now layer the catastrophes on top of one another the way they actually fell, because no single one of them brought down the Ming. It was the stacking. The historian Timothy Brook, in his work on this period, makes a distinction I keep coming back to. He separates the actors on the stage from the stage itself, and he argues that the stage, the physical environment, dealt the late Ming a worse hand than any Chinese dynasty had been dealt in centuries. Brook walks through the relentless sequence almost year by year. Famine in 1632, epidemic disease in 1633, and again in 1635. Locust swarms in 1635. Another epidemic in 1636. And then, from 1637, the drought settling in and refusing to lift. By his accounting, something like 80% of the counties of China had effectively stopped sending tax revenue to the central government. Think about what that means for a state already starving for silver. The catastrophe did not just kill peasants. It severed the revenue that might have funded any response to the catastrophe. The disaster defunded the rescue. And I want you to feel the relentlessness of it, because a list of bad years on a page does not convey what it is to live inside a decade that will not relent. Imagine a farming family in the north going into the first failed harvest with whatever reserves a careful household keeps. A little stored grain, a little saved silver, a few animals. The first bad year is survivable. You eat the reserves, you sell an animal. You tell yourself the rains will come back, because in any normal lifetime, the rains always come back. Then, the second year fails. Now the reserves are gone, and the animals are sold, and the tax collector still arrives. Because the tax does not pause for the weather, and the silver the tax demands has become more expensive than ever, precisely because everyone is desperate for it. Then the third year fails. Then the locusts come and eat what little the drought left. Then disease moves through the weakened, half-starved population and takes the children first. Each year does not merely repeat the last one, it compounds it, because each year you enter with less than you had before, and the demands on you do not shrink. This is how a population goes from hungry to desperate to willing to follow anyone who promises that the taxes will stop. By the time the gazetteers are recording bark and roots, and the unspeakable things that come after bark and roots, the people writing those entries are describing the far end of a process that started years earlier with one failed harvest and a tax bill that would not bend. The state, looking at this from the capital, saw falling revenue and reached for savings. The people living it saw the end of the world arriving one failed season at a time, and waited, with nothing left to lose, for someone to come. The local records from these years are among the most harrowing documents in the historical record of any civilization, and I am going to tell you what they say plainly, because softening it would be its own kind of lie. A gazetteer from the region around the capital, for the winter of 1639 into 1640 records wheat selling at a price that put it out of reach of ordinary people. It describes the population first stripping the bark from trees and digging up the roots of weeds to eat. And then, when the bark and the roots were gone, it records that people turned to eating one another. The same entry notes that epidemic disease swept through what was left, and that in some places, in the chilling formula the records use again and again, not 1 person in 10 survived. Not 1 in 10. Read that the way the people writing it meant it. They were describing the disappearance of 9 out of every 10 human beings in a place, in a season, from a combination of hunger and plague that the wealthiest empire on earth had no functioning capacity left to relieve, and the plague was its own horseman. From the early 1630s, a wave of epidemic disease, which a number of scholars have linked to plague, moved through the population, and in the early 1640s, it reached Beijing itself. The accounts of the capital in these years describe mass death on a scale that is hard to absorb. By some estimates, more than 200,000 people died in Beijing in the single year of 1643. A fifth, perhaps a quarter, of the entire city gone in 12 months. And here is the detail that connects the dying directly to the dynasty's military doom. The garrison of Beijing, the soldiers who were supposed to defend the imperial capital against the rebel armies gathering in the provinces, had been roughly 100,000 strong. By the time those rebel armies arrived at the walls, plague and desertion and unpaid wages had hollowed that garrison out to something like 50,000, many of them sick, starving, and owed back pay they would never see. The capital that needed to be a fortress had been turned, by disease, into a hospice. I keep using language that makes the climate sound like it had intentions, and I want to be careful about that, because the cooling did not have intentions. There was no malice in it. A shift in global temperature, driven by the sun and the oceans and the volcanoes, does not decide to punish a dynasty. But I also think the instinct to reach for that language is telling us something true about the experience of living through it. To the people inside it, the catastrophe did not feel like a neutral statistical fluctuation in mean temperature. It felt like the world itself had turned against them, like some force had withdrawn its support at the exact moment they needed it most, like the ground they had always stood on had quietly decided to stop holding them up. And the deepest horror of the late Ming is that the sky and the silver and the state all withdrew their support at the same time, in the same regions, on the same people. In a convergence so precise, it is almost impossible not to read as design, even though you know it was not. Three systems that had nothing to do with one another: the climate, the global bullion trade, and the imperial treasury, all failed together. In the Northwest, in the 1630s, on the same desperate human beings. Now hold all of that in your mind: the dead villages, the tripled real taxes, the dry riverbeds, the cannibalism in the gazetteers, the plague hollowing out the capital, and remember what the imperial court was doing in the middle of it. It was looking for savings. It was trimming expenses. It was identifying bloated programs and cutting them back to balance a budget that could not be balanced. And one of the programs it had identified and cut right at the start of this descent was the relay system. The network of stations and couriers concentrated most heavily in the Northwest. The Northwest that was, at that very moment, becoming the epicenter of the worst drought in 1500 years. So consider what the cut actually was, in context. From inside the treasury, it was a line item, an abused and expensive program trimmed to save 685,000 taels. But on the ground, in Shanxi, in the 1630s, it was something else entirely. It was the removal of one of the last functioning state institutions in a region that was already collapsing. The relay stations had been more than couriers. They had been employers, paying steady silver wages in a place where silver had nearly vanished. They had been the threads still connecting a dying frontier to a living center. And the court, reasoning soundly from the ledger, pulled those threads out and released into the worst famine in over a millennium tens of thousands of men who were now unemployed, who were hungry, who were angry, who knew the roads of the empire better than anyone alive, because moving along those roads had been their job, and who, many of them, knew how to ride and how to fight. What the cut did, in the end, was take the empire's own nervous system, sever it, and scatter its severed pieces across the one province where they were most likely to reassemble into something the empire would not survive. The state had created, with a single responsible budgetary decision, a population of skilled, mobile, desperate men in the exact place and at the exact moment when all they needed was someone to follow. And in Shanxi, in those years that someone was coming, he was a young man from a county called Mizi. He had worked, by the most widely repeated account, at one of those very relay stations, and history would come to know him by a title that translates as the Dashing King. Li Zicheng was born around 1606 in Mizi County, in northern Shanxi, into exactly the kind of poverty that the late Ming produced in enormous quantities. He was a herdsman as a boy. He grew up hard, in a hard place, in the dry hills of the Northwest, and as a young man he found work, by the account that became standard, at a relay station. He was, in other words, part of the very system we have been talking about. One of the tens of thousands of men whose modest, steady livelihood depended on the network of couriers and horses and way stations that the imperial court had decided to cut. And here I have to slow down and be scrupulously honest with you, because this is the single most repeated claim in the entire popular telling of this story, and it is more contested than the popular telling admits. The clean, devastating version goes like this. Li Zicheng was a postal worker. The government cut the postal service to save money. Li lost his job, was thrown into desperation, joined the rebels out of spite and hunger, and personally led the army that destroyed the dynasty that had fired him. It is an almost unbearably perfect story. The laid-off government employee who burns down the government. And precisely because it is so perfect, you should be suspicious of it, and I was, so I went looking at what the sources actually say. The official Ming history. the Ming Shai, compiled under the dynasty that replaced them, does describe Li as having served at a relay station. Another major historical work calls him a relay clerk. So the postal connection is not invented out of nothing. It sits in serious sources. But a contemporary account of the rebellions, written closer to the events, the Suiko Jilu, does not mention postal work at all in explaining his fall, and instead points to a legal case, trouble with debt, and the law, as what pushed him over the edge. And even among the sources that do say he lost his post, the proximate reason given is sometimes not the budget cut at all, but something more mundane and personal. An accusation that he lost or mishandled official documents. The most cautious modern reference works, the ones that hate a good story precisely because it is a good story, tend to omit the postal layoff from his biography entirely. So the honest answer is that we cannot say with confidence that Li Zicheng personally lost his specific job to Liu Mao's specific cut. The perfect symbol may be a little too perfect. But watch what happens when you let go of the individual claim, because the systemic claim does not weaken. It gets stronger, and it gets more disturbing. Because here is what the official Ming history itself says, not about Li Zicheng the man, but about the dismissed couriers as a group. It records, in its treatise on the economy, that the relay workers who had been cut off had no way to feed themselves, and that they followed one another, one after another, into joining the roving bandits in revolt. That is the official verdict of the historians who buried the dynasty. The cut created a mass of starving, skilled, unemployed men, and that mass flowed into the rebellions. Whether or not Li personally was one specific drop in that flood, the flood is real, and the cut is what released it. The dynasty did not need to fire the one man who would lead the army. It only needed to manufacture the army and hand that army to whoever could lead it. It manufactured the army. The leader would take care of himself. And he did. Li Zicheng joined the rebel bands swirling through the famine country of the northwest around 1630. He rose through them, serving under his maternal uncle, a rebel chief named Gao Yingshang, who carried the title Dashing King. When Gao was captured and executed by Ming forces in 1636, Li inherited both his uncle's followers and his uncle's title. He became the Dashing King, and for several years he was just one warlord among many, winning some, losing badly others, at one low point reduced to a tiny band hiding in the mountains, the kind of figure who in a healthier empire would have been hunted down and forgotten. The Ming did beat him, more than once. The problem was that the conditions that produced him did not go away when he was beaten. The drought did not lift. The silver did not return. The couriers stayed unemployed. So every time the empire put down a rebellion, the famine simply grew it back. You cannot kill a symptom while the disease is accelerating. What changed Li from a warlord into a dynasty killer was not just military luck. It was an idea, and the idea was handed to him by a literate gentry advisor traditionally named Lian, who joined the movement around 1639 and helped transform it from a roving band of desperate men into something with a program and a message. The genius of that message was that it spoke directly to the exact wound the silver trap and the tax surcharges had opened. The rebels began spreading a slogan promising that if the people welcomed the Dashing King, they would pay no grain taxes. Think about how that lands on a peasant who has watched the real weight of his silver taxes triple, while the rain refused to fall and the state kept sending collectors. The rebellion stopped being banditry and started being relief. It offered the one thing the empire had made impossible, which was the simple ability to keep what you grew. Men did not have to be recruited at sword point. They came. By 1641, Li Zicheng was strong enough to take the city of Luoyang, and what happened there shows you the moral fury that the tax catastrophe had loaded into the rebellion. Luoyang was the seat of a Ming prince, Zhu Chongzhen, the Prince of Fu, a man so spectacularly wealthy and so famously fat that he had become a symbol of everything rotten about the dynasty. While the surrounding countryside starved, the prince sat on an immense hoarded fortune. When the rebels broke into the city, they killed him, and the stories that grew up around his death, whether or not they are literally true, tell you everything about how the people felt. They said the rebels confiscated his treasure and distributed his grain to the starving. The hoarder who sat on wealth while the region died became, in the rebellion's telling, a feast for the people he had let starve. That is not the imagery of a tax revolt. That is the imagery of a reckoning. From Luoyang, the dashing king's power compounded. He took the great city of Xi'an in 1643, the ancient capital, and there, at the start of 1644, he did the thing that turns a rebel into a claimant. He proclaimed a new dynasty, the Great Shan, with himself at its head, and he turned his army toward Beijing. And I want you to hold on to the cruelest irony in this entire story as that army began to move, because it is the kind of irony that I genuinely do not know how to sit comfortably with. The empire had cut its relay network to save money. The relay network was the system that knew the roads. It knew the distances between stations, the river crossings, the mountain passes, the fastest routes between any 2 points in the realm, because moving along those routes at speed had been its entire reason to exist. And now, an army stiffened by former couriers, men who had carried the empire's own messages along the empire's own roads, was using that knowledge to march on the empire's own capital. The nervous system the state had severed to save 685,000 taels had reassembled itself into the body that was coming to kill it. The infrastructure had become the weapon. It is worth lingering on how close the Ming came, more than once, to ending Li Zicheng before he ever reached this point, because the near misses are part of what makes the story so unbearable. This was not an unstoppable juggernaut rolling smoothly to victory. Li was beaten badly several times. In the late 1630s, imperial commanders ran his forces into the ground, and at one of his lowest moments, he was reduced to a remnant of a handful of men, hiding in the mountains, finished by any reasonable measure. A more fortunate dynasty would have buried him there and moved on. But every time the Ming defeated the rebel, it could not defeat the conditions that kept producing the rebellion, and so the rebel kept coming back, refilled by the same inexhaustible supply of the desperate. A beaten warlord in a healthy country stays beaten. A beaten warlord in a country where the rain has stopped and the couriers have been dismissed and the taxes have tripled is simply a warlord between recruitment drives. The famine was his quartermaster. The silver crisis was his recruiting sergeant. The relay cut was his officer corps. He did not have to win every battle. He only had to survive his defeats long enough for the catastrophe to rebuild his army, and the catastrophe was tireless. And when the literate advisors joined him and gave the movement a program, it stopped being merely survivable and became genuinely attractive, which is a different and far more dangerous thing. The Shan forces under Li began, by the accounts that come down to us, to impose a discipline that distinguished them from ordinary bandits, to present themselves not as looters, but as deliverers, to spread the promise of an end to the crushing grain taxes that had broken the countryside. Whether the reality always matched the promise is beside the point. The promise itself was a weapon more powerful than any cavalry, because it spoke to the exact wound the silver trap had opened in tens of millions of people. A government that has made it impossible for you to keep what you grow has handed its enemy the most persuasive recruiting message imaginable, which is simply, follow us, and you will be allowed to live. By the time the dashing king took Xi'an and proclaimed his dynasty, He was not leading a rebellion against the Ming so much as collecting the human wreckage the Ming had been manufacturing for 15 years. And there was a great deal of it. And it was very angry. And a good portion of it knew exactly how to move an army across the country at speed, because moving across the country at speed had once been its job. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time with this story, and the thing that keeps me up is not the drama of the march on Beijing. It is the quiet, structural lesson underneath it, and I am going to say it plainly now, because we are about to cross from the past into the present, and you need to be carrying it when we do. The cut that killed the Ming was not stupidity. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because it would be comforting to believe these were idiots and that we, being cleverer, are safe. They were not idiots. The cut was the considered, defensible, fiscally literate response of serious people to a genuine shortage of money. And that is exactly why it was lethal. Austerity during fragility is not a failure of intelligence. It is closer to an immune response, the instinctive reaction of a frightened system trying to protect itself by shutting things down. And the horror of it is that the immune response, in this specific situation, attacks the body it is trying to save. By the time a state is fragile enough to feel that it has no choice but to cut, the cut has become the thing most likely to finish it. And the people inside cannot tell the difference, because from the inside, in the moment with the ledger open in front of them, the cut does not feel like a death sentence. It feels like the only adult thing left to do. That feeling, the feeling of grim responsibility, of finally making the hard choice, is not a sign that you are safe. It is the exact feeling the Chongzhen court had in 1629, and it is a feeling being felt right now in rooms in at least 4 capital cities by people who are certain they are not making the mistake you are watching the Ming make. We will get to those rooms, but first we have to finish what happened in Beijing, because the ending is worse than just a fallen dynasty. And the way it is worse is the key to the whole thing. In the early spring of 1644, the dashing king's army moved on the capital, and the capital could not stop it, because the capital had been eaten from the inside by everything we have already described. The soldiers manning the walls had not been paid. Many were sick. The treasury that should have funded a desperate last defense was the same treasury that had been scrounging for savings of 685,000 taels a decade and a half earlier, and it was emptier now than it had ever been. There is a grim story, impossible to fully verify, but entirely in keeping with the situation, that in the final crisis, the emperor begged the wealthy officials and nobles of his court to contribute their private fortunes to pay the soldiers defending them, and that they pleaded poverty and gave almost nothing, hoarding their silver to the very end, as if the city were not about to fall on top of it. Whether or not every detail is true, it captures the rot precisely. The money existed. It had simply pooled in the hands of people who would rather lose the empire than spend it. On the 24th and 25th of April, 1644, the rebel army entered Beijing. The accounts say the gates were opened from the inside by defenders who saw no reason to die for a dynasty that had not paid them and could not protect them. The dashing king, the former rebel from the famine hills of Shaanxi, the man whose movement had been built out of the human wreckage of the silver trap and the relay cut, rode into the imperial capital of the Ming. The last Ming emperor, the Chongzhen emperor, whose personal name was Zhu Youjian, spent his final hours doing things that are almost too painful to recount. By the traditional account, he gathered his family. He ordered the women of his household to take their own lives rather than be captured, and he is said to have turned a blade on his own daughters with his own hands, so that they would not fall into rebel hands alive. Then, in the grey hours, he climbed the small artificial hill that rises just behind the Forbidden City. The hill that is variously called Coal Hill or Prospect Hill or, today, Jingshan. And there, on that hill, looking down over the palace from which his family had ruled for 276 years, the last emperor of the Ming hanged himself from a tree. The traditional accounts say he left a final message written in his own hand, sometimes said to have been written on the collar of his robe, and the substance of it, as it has come down to us, is almost unbearable in its self-accusation and its mercy. He blamed his own failures and the failures of his officials for what had happened, and he asked the rebels, who were about to possess everything he had, not to harm his people. The people, he said in effect, were not to blame. They had only ever been the victims of those who governed them. He was right about that, and the fact that he could see it clearly enough to write it down at the moment of his death, and yet had presided over the policies that crushed those same people, is the whole tragedy of governance, compressed into one man on one hill. He understood, far too late, that the catastrophe had a human cost, and that the cost had fallen on the innocent. What he never seems to have understood, what almost nobody in his position ever understands in time, is that some of the specific decisions taken to save the state were the decisions that doomed it. He died believing he had failed through weakness and bad advisors. He had also failed through a kind of competence, the narrow competence of an administration that balanced what it could measure while the unmeasured ground gave way beneath it. And here is where the story delivers its final, almost mocking twist, the part that should genuinely unsettle anyone who imagines that collapse at least rewards the people who caused it or the people who fought it. The dashing king did not get to keep what he had taken. He sat in the conquered capital for roughly 40 days. He had himself proclaimed emperor of his new Great Shun dynasty in early June of 1644. And then it all came apart with stunning speed, because the collapse of the Ming had not produced a winner, it had produced a vacuum. And vacuums get filled by whoever is standing closest to the hole. Standing closest to the hole, in this case, was a Ming general named Wu Sangui, who commanded a hardened army of perhaps 40,000 men guarding the critical pass at Shanghai, the place where the Great Wall meets the sea, the gateway between China proper and the Manchu lands to the northeast. Wu Sangui was caught in an impossible position, with the rebel Shun behind him in Beijing and the Manchu armies in front of him beyond the wall. And he made his choice. He opened the gate. He allied with the Manchus, the very enemy the entire northern military apparatus of the Ming had existed to keep out, and together they turned on Li Zicheng. The Manchu banners poured through the pass that had held them out for decades, defeated the dashing king's forces, and drove him out of Beijing almost as quickly as he had taken it. Li Zicheng fled west and south, his new dynasty evaporating around him, and within roughly a year he was dead, killed in circumstances that remain murky, hunted down in the countryside. The man who had toppled the largest empire on earth, dying as obscurely as he had been born. So count what the cut accomplished, because the accounting is the most damning part of the whole story. The Ming court cut the relay system to save 685,000 taels of silver. That cut helped manufacture the rebel army that took the capital. That army's victory created the vacuum that let the Manchus through the wall. The Manchus founded the Qing dynasty, which ruled China for the next 268 years. So the immediate fiscal benefit of the cut was 685,000 taels, and the eventual cost of the cut was the entire Ming dynasty and 2.5 centuries of foreign rule. And now weigh that 685,000 against what it was actually up against, because this is the number that should make you angry. The Ming state's fiscal hole was not measured in hundreds of thousands of taels. The war against the Manchus alone was consuming millions of taels a year. The emergency surtaxes piled onto the peasantry were reaching for millions. The shortfall the court faced was a structural chasm of millions upon millions of taels, year after year. The relay savings, set against that chasm, were what an old Chinese phrase calls a single cup of water thrown on a cartload of burning firewood. They changed nothing about the fiscal crisis. They could not have. The math was never close. The cut was fiscally meaningless and strategically fatal. The court reached past the millions it could not fix, found a few 100,000 it could, optimized that, declared victory on the ledger, and in doing so lit the fuse on the thing that ended them. That is the pattern in its purest form, and once you have seen it clearly, you cannot stop seeing it. A fragile system facing a problem in the millions reaches instinctively for the savings it can actually achieve in the hundreds of thousands, because the small fixable thing feels like control, and the large unfixable thing feels like despair. The cut does not solve the real problem, because the real problem was never the size of the relay budget. But the cut does real damage, because the thing being cut was load-bearing in ways the ledger could not show. The state trades a fortune in stability for a pittance in savings, and it does so feeling responsible the entire time, right up until the courier it dismissed is standing in the throne room. If this were only history, it would be a tragedy and a warning, a thing to study and shake your head over and feel safely distant from. But it is not only history. The reason I have walked you through all of this, the silver and the drought and the couriers and the hill, is that the specific decision at the center of it is not a quaint feature of a vanished world. It is a live policy. It is a default that fragile states reach for in the present tense, with the same grim sense of responsibility, with the same clean savings figures, with the same blindness to what is load-bearing and what is not. And right now, as you listen to this, it is being implemented in different costumes and different languages in at least 4 governments. So let us go and look at the rooms where the memo is being signed today, and let us see whether anyone has learned the thing that the Chongzhen court died not knowing. The economists have a name for the thing the Ming did, and it is not a flattering one. They call it pro-cyclical fiscal contraction. Strip the jargon away and it means cutting public spending at the exact moment the economy is contracting, when the system is already weak, instead of waiting for strength to return. It is the opposite of what most modern macroeconomics since the 1930s has said you should do. The conventional wisdom, hard-won from the Great Depression, is that you cut in the good times when the economy can absorb it, and you spend, or at least hold steady, in the bad times when withdrawal of state support will deepen the very collapse you are worried about. Cutting into a downturn is supposed to be the cardinal error, the textbook mistake, the thing serious people are not supposed to do. And yet, serious people do it, constantly, all over the world, because in the moment, it does not feel like the cardinal error. It feels like prudence. The political scientist Mark Blythe wrote an entire history of this idea and gave it a subtitle that doubles as a verdict. He called austerity a dangerous idea. Other economists, watching austerity programs deepen recessions across Europe after 2010, documented again and again that the cuts tended to shrink the economy faster than they shrank the debt, so that countries often ended up with a higher debt burden after years of painful cutting than they had started with. The cut, in other words, frequently fails even at the one thing it is supposed to be good at, which is fixing the finances. Hold that finding, because it is going to matter enormously for the first of our 4 modern cases. The Ming relay cut saved a sum that was meaningless against the real fiscal hole. The modern version of that, The cut that does not even achieve the savings it promises is not a hypothetical. It just happened in the largest economy on earth, and it is the cleanest rhyme with the Ming story that I have ever come across, because it involves, of all the institutions in the world that could have been chosen, the people who carry the mail. In early 2025, the new administration in the United States launched what it called the Department of Government Efficiency, an effort to dramatically shrink the federal workforce in the name of saving money and cutting waste. The scale of it was genuinely historic. By the accounting of the federal government's own personnel office, something on the order of 317,000 federal employees were expected to have left the workforce by the end of 2025, a reduction of around 13.7% compared to the previous year. The mechanisms were varied. There were mass deferred resignation offers, taken by something like 75,000 workers in the first wave alone. There were efforts to strip job protections from career civil servants so they could be removed more easily. There were outright firings of newer employees, some of which were challenged in court and partly reversed, before the Supreme Court, in the summer of 2025, allowed the broader reductions to proceed over a lone dissent. Whole agencies were hollowed out. And among the institutions told to cut, the United States Postal Service agreed to shed something like 10,000 jobs. Sit with that for a moment, because the rhyme is almost too neat to be real. The Ming Dynasty cut its postal relay couriers to save money and help destroy itself. And here, 400 years later, in the largest and richest economy that has ever existed, one of the headline acts of a sweeping austerity drive was again a cut to the people who carry the mail. I am not claiming the United States Postal Service is going to produce a dashing king. The analogy is structural, not prophetic, and I am allergic to the kind of lazy doom-mongering that pretends history repeats on a fixed schedule. But the structural echo is exact. A fragile system, anxious about its finances, reaching first for its own connective infrastructure, the boring, unglamorous network that holds distant places in contact with the center, because that network is large and visible and looks like an obvious place to economize. The relay system looked like waste to the Ming treasury too. It was not waste, it was load-bearing. The question of what, in any modern state, is quietly load-bearing in ways the ledger cannot see is not a question that gets asked when the savings figure is sitting right there, clean and countable and politically irresistible. And here is the part that completes the rhyme, the part that should make you think very hard. Did it even work, on its own terms? Did the Great Efficiency Drive actually fix the finances it was launched to fix? According to analysis from the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank that is broadly sympathetic to the goal of shrinking government and therefore not a hostile witness, the effort cut federal employment by hundreds of thousands of jobs, and federal spending kept rising anyway. By their accounting, federal outlays were running well over $200 billion higher at one point late in the year than they had been at the same point the year before, and the deficit for the fiscal year grew by close to $2 trillion. The cuts were real. The pain to the people who lost their jobs and to the citizens who depended on the services those workers provided. The tax processing, the retirement benefits, the veterans' health care, the food safety inspections was real. But the fiscal payoff, the entire stated justification, did not materialize, because the things that actually drive the budget were never the salaries of the couriers and the clerks. The drivers were elsewhere, in the millions and the trillions, in places the cut did not touch. The Ming saved 685,000 taels against a whole of millions. A modern government cut hundreds of thousands of workers against a deficit that grew by trillions. The shape is identical. Reach past the unfixable thing, optimize the fixable thing, damage what was load-bearing, and call it responsibility. And as with the Ming relay system, the damage that does not show up in the savings figure is the kind that takes years or decades to fully reveal itself. State capacity is not a thing you can switch off and switch back on at will. When you push out 100,000 experienced workers through resignation offers and the stripping of job protections and the firing of newer employees, some of it challenged in the courts and partly reversed before the higher courts let the broader cuts proceed, you do not simply remove a cost. You remove institutional memory, the accumulated knowledge of how things actually work that lives in the heads of people who have done a job for 20 years and is written down nowhere. You remove the capacity to process the tax returns that fund the government, to deliver the benefits that millions of retirees depend on, to inspect the food and the drugs, to keep the basic machinery of a modern state turning. One organization that studies the federal workforce warned that the harm done in a single year could take decades to repair, because rebuilding expertise is far slower than destroying it. A skilled worker can be dismissed in an afternoon. Replacing the knowledge that walked out the door with that worker can take a generation. The savings hit the ledger this year, clean and countable and ready to be announced. The cost arrives slowly, in the form of a state that works a little worse at everything, that responds a little slower to every crisis, that has quietly lost some of its ability to do the things citizens assume a government can always do. And that loss does not appear as a line item anywhere, because there is no account called the capacity of the state to function, even though it may be the single most valuable thing any state possesses. But the United States is, for all the disruption, a fantastically wealthy and resilient state, and I do not want to overstate the immediate danger there, because to do so would be exactly the kind of unearned drama I keep warning against. The structural lesson is clearer, and frankly more alarming, in places where the underlying fragility is far greater. Which brings us to the second room, and to a man who did not bother to disguise what he was doing behind euphemisms about efficiency, but instead walked onto a stage holding a chainsaw. In Argentina, Javier Milei took office in December of 2023, having campaigned, literally, with a chainsaw as his symbol, a promise to take the motosierra to the state. And he was not bluffing. Argentina was a genuinely desperate case, an economy with inflation running at rates that are hard to even comprehend, with one figure cited around 276% on an annualized basis, a country that had defaulted on its debts repeatedly across its modern history and was once again at the edge. Milei, slashed. By the accounting of one Argentine Economic Research Center drawing on the National Statistics Agency, the federal government workforce was cut by something like 63,234 positions across his first 2 years, a reduction of roughly 18%. The state news agency was gutted, with hundreds dismissed. The national airline shed nearly 2,000 jobs. The water utility cut over 1,700. More than 200,000 welfare arrangements were terminated. He signed a new arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, worth around $20 billion. And the country erupted in repeated general strikes, the largest labor organizations shutting the nation down more than once, with a nationwide stoppage in the spring of 2025. Now, in the spirit of the honesty I promised you, I have to complicate my own argument here, because the Argentine case is the one that does not fit the thesis cleanly. And you should know that, because a story that only tells you the evidence that supports it is propaganda, not history. Milei's austerity, brutal as it was accompanied by something the simple anti-austerity story does not predict. Inflation, the monster that had been devouring Argentine life for years, actually began to come down, and in some measures came down dramatically. For a great many economists, Argentina is shaping up to be the strongest piece of evidence in a generation that severe fiscal discipline, applied to a specific kind of crisis, a crisis of runaway money printing and lost credibility, can actually work, can break the fever, can begin a real stabilization. If Argentina comes out the other side of this with durable low inflation and renewed growth, and without the social fabric tearing irreparably, then it will stand as a genuine counterexample to everything the Ming story seems to teach. And intellectual honesty requires me to tell you that the jury is still out, and that the early signs on the inflation front are for the government's defenders. The thesis is not that all austerity always fails. The thesis is narrower and stranger and harder to act on, and we are going to sharpen it to its final point before this is over. But it is not a slogan, and Argentina is the case that keeps it from becoming one. The third room is in Paris, and the French case is valuable because it shows you a different failure mode of the same logic. Not a cut that fails to save money, as in the American case, and not a cut that might actually work, as Argentina might. France shows you the cut that destroys the government attempting it before the cut can even take effect. It is austerity as political suicide, the policy so dangerous to handle that it kills the hand that reaches for it. In the middle of 2025, the French Prime Minister François Bayrou unveiled a savings plan worth around 43.8 billion euros, aimed at dragging the country's budget deficit down from over 5% of national output towards something closer to 4.5% the following year. The centerpiece was a measure the French called the Année Blanche, the blank year, a freeze on public spending and pensions and benefits, refusing to let them rise with inflation, which is a tax increase and a benefit cut wearing the costume of doing nothing. The plan also proposed cutting thousands of civil service jobs and, in a detail that tells you how hard the government was scraping, abolishing 2 public holidays to squeeze a little more work out of the calendar. It was, once again, the responsible sounding package, the difficult medicine, the grown-up choice presented by serious people who could read the debt figures and were frightened by them. And the French political system simply could not swallow it. What followed was one of the most remarkable stretches of governmental instability in the modern history of a major democracy, and austerity was at the center of all of it. Bayrou's government fell over the budget. His successor as Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, formed a government that, by the accounting of the chaos that month, lasted less than 14 hours before collapsing, among the shortest-lived governments in French history. To survive his second attempt at governing, Lecornu was forced to suspend a signature pension reform, the very kind of structural austerity the whole exercise had been about, because it was politically radioactive. The ratings agency Standard & Poor's, watching the spectacle, downgraded France's credit rating. And the unions brought millions into the streets, with one day of national protest in the autumn of 2025, featuring something like 260 demonstrations across the country, and large fractions of the teaching workforce walking out. France did not collapse. France is a stable, wealthy, deeply institutionalized democracy, and it is not going to produce a dashing king either. But watch the mechanism, because it is the Ming mechanism viewed from a different angle. The attempt to impose fiscal contraction on a stressed and unwilling society did not stabilize the state. It paralyzed it. It burned through governments. It turned the act of trying to be responsible into a source of chronic instability that may, in the end, do more damage to French credibility than the deficit it was meant to cure. And then there is the fourth room, and it is the one with the highest body count, because it is in a country with the least cushion to absorb the shock. In Nigeria, on the 29th of May, 2023, on his first day in office, President Bola Tinubu announced the end of a long-standing fuel subsidy. The subsidy was, by any technocratic standard, a genuine problem. It was estimated to cost the Nigerian treasury something like $10 billion a year, an enormous sum, by some measures approaching a quarter of the entire national budget, money that arguably could have been spent on almost anything more productive than holding down the price of petrol. Every international lender, every visiting economist, every reform-minded technocrat had been saying for years that the subsidy had to go. It was wasteful, it was regressive, it distorted the economy. Removing it was, in the textbook sense, exactly the right thing to do. It was the responsible choice. It was the adult in the room, and the effect on ordinary Nigerians was devastating with a speed that is hard to convey. The price of petrol rocketed from around 185 naira a litre to something like 1,025 naira within roughly a year. At the same time, the government floated the currency, and the naira collapsed against the dollar, falling from something like 460 to the dollar toward 1,700. In a country where almost everything moves by road and almost everything depends on the price of fuel and the value of the currency, this was not an abstract fiscal adjustment. It was a detonation in the cost of staying alive. A joint assessment by the World Bank and Nigeria's own Statistics Bureau found more than 129 million Nigerians living below the poverty line, an increase of roughly 25 million people pushed into poverty in a single year. 25 million human beings. That is not a rounding error in a budget. That is a population the size of a medium country falling through the floor because a subsidy was removed in the name of fiscal responsibility, at a moment when the society had no buffer left to absorb the blow. The country saw nationwide strikes, and in the summer of 2024, it saw a wave of demonstrations that took the name End Bad Governance, as inflation hit levels not seen in a generation. I want to put one more case beside Nigeria, briefly, because it shows the lethal end of the spectrum most starkly of all, and it is impossible to discuss this pattern honestly without it. In Kenya, in 2024, the government, under pressure to service a debt load that had climbed towards 70% of national output, and operating within the framework of an International Monetary Fund program, introduced a finance bill packed with new taxes, aiming to raise something on the order of $2.5 billion. The bill was again the responsible-sounding fiscal package, the kind of revenue-raising austerity that lenders applaud. And the young people of Kenya, the generation that would have to pay for it, took to the streets in a movement that organized around rejecting the bill, and the state met them with live ammunition. By the time it was over, dozens of protesters were dead, shot in the streets of Nairobi, and the president withdrew the bill. And in the aftermath, a spokesperson for the International Monetary Fund expressed regret for the loss of life, while making clear that the underlying push for fiscal consolidation would have to continue. Read that sequence again and tell me it does not rhyme with everything we have seen. A fragile state, a fiscal squeeze imposed in the name of responsibility, a population with nothing left to give, blood in the streets, and the institutions that demanded the squeeze offering their condolences while insisting that the squeeze go on. The Chongzhen court would have recognized every beat of it. So count them, because the counting is the point. 4 governments: the United States, cutting its workforce including its postal carriers, while its deficit grew anyway. Argentina, taking a chainsaw to the state, with results that genuinely might vindicate it, or might not. France, burning through governments in the attempt to impose a freeze its society would not accept. Nigeria, removing a subsidy by the book and pushing 25 million people into poverty in a year. And Kenya beside them, where the same logic produced corpses. 4-5 if you count Kenya, all reaching for fiscal contraction under stress, all certain they are doing the responsible thing, none of them remembering, or perhaps ever having known, what happened the last time the largest empire on earth made the same considered, defensible, adult choice. Now I owe you the sharper version of the argument, because I have been circling something and it is time to land it. And landing it requires admitting that not all austerity is the same, and that the lazy slogan, "cutting is always bad," is false, and you should not believe it. Argentina is the proof that it is false. So what actually distinguishes the cut that saves from the cut that kills? Why did fiscal discipline begin to break the fever in Buenos Aires, while an arguably similar instinct helped end the Ming? The answer is the whole game, and once you see it, you will never read a budget headline the same way again. It comes down to what the binding constraint actually is. In some crises, the thing strangling the system is the state's own loss of credibility. Argentina's catastrophe was, at its root, a crisis of confidence. The government had printed money until the currency was a joke, until nobody believed a peso would hold its value for a week. And in that specific kind of crisis, the binding constraint is trust. When trust is the thing that has broken, a brutal demonstration of discipline can actually be the cure, because it restores the one thing that was missing. The pain of the cut is the price of buying back belief. That is the case for austerity at its strongest, and it is real, and Argentina may well be living proof of it. But the late Ming was not suffering a crisis of confidence. The Ming was suffering a crisis of the real. The binding constraint was not that people had stopped believing in the dynasty's bookkeeping. The binding constraint was that the rain had stopped, the silver had vanished, the fields were dead, and millions of human beings had nothing to eat. No demonstration of fiscal discipline restores rain. No balanced budget refills a dry riverbed or brings imported silver across an ocean that has stopped sending it. When the binding constraint is real resources and real human desperation, cutting does not buy back anything, because nothing that was lost was a matter of belief. The cut just removes one more piece of the scaffolding from a structure that is already failing under physical load. And worse, in the Ming case, the specific thing cut did not merely fail to help. It actively converted the state's own infrastructure and the state's own employees into the raw material of the rebellion. That is the difference. Austerity into a crisis of confidence can restore confidence. Austerity into a crisis of the real removes support from people who are drowning, and then acts surprised when they pull the system down with them as they go under. And here is the trap inside the trap. The reason this distinction does not save anyone. The reason knowing all of this is not enough. From inside the room in the moment, the two kinds of crisis look almost identical. They both present as a budget that does not balance, a deficit that frightens the markets, a pile of obligations the state cannot meet. The numbers on the page that describe a crisis of confidence look exactly like the numbers on the page that describe a crisis of the real. They are both just red ink. The instrument that the Treasury reaches for, the cut, is the same in both cases. And the feeling, that grim, sober, responsible feeling of finally making the hard choice, is identical in both cases too. The Argentine official cutting into a crisis of confidence, and the Ming official cutting into a crisis of the real felt, I would bet everything. Exactly the same flavor of righteous fiscal courage. One of them was right. One of them was helping to end his civilization. And in the moment, from the inside, neither could have told you with certainty which one he was. That is what I mean when I say this thing behaves almost like it has a will of its own. And I want to be careful here because I am not a mystic and I do not think there is a malevolent intelligence in the world's treasuries. But there is a logic, and the logic does not care who is holding it. Look at the 4 rooms again and notice what they have in common, because it should be impossible. Javier Milei is a self-described anarcho-capitalist libertarian who would tear the state down to its foundations on principle. The American efficiency drive came from a populist movement of the right that ran against the establishment. François Bayrou is a veteran centrist, a man of the careful middle. Bola Tinubu governs a vast developing democracy with its own entirely distinct politics. These men agree on almost nothing. They come from opposite ends of every spectrum we use to sort political actors. And yet the same logic reached into all 4 of their governments and produced the same move: the cut under stress, the contraction into fragility, the responsible amputation. A pattern that crosses libertarian and populist and centrist and developing world politics with equal ease is not an ideology. Ideologies do not behave that way. This is something underneath ideology. It is what fragile systems do when they get frightened, regardless of who happens to be steering them, and the steerers mistake it for their own considered choice, when really it is closer to a reflex that has selected them. They think they are reaching for the chainsaw. The chainsaw is reaching for them. The Chongzhen emperor reached for it. He was not a libertarian or a populist or a centrist. He was a Confucian autocrat at the head of a 400-year-old dynasty, and the same logic found him too. 4 centuries before any of the words we use to describe modern politics existed. That is how deep this runs. This is not a feature of capitalism or democracy or any modern arrangement at all, but something far older, a feature of fragile systems under stress, in any century, under any flag, and the only thing that changes across the centuries is the vocabulary the cutters use to reassure themselves while they do it. The Ming called it eliminating waste and abuse. We call it efficiency and consolidation and fiscal responsibility. The words are different. The reflex is identical, and the reflex is being triggered right now in rooms full of intelligent and sincere people who are absolutely certain that they are the exception, that their cut is the Argentina kind and not the Ming kind, that they have read the situation correctly where others failed. Some of them are right. By the brutal arithmetic of history, most of them eventually are not. So why can they not see it? That is the question that should be bothering you by now, because everyone in this story, the Ming officials and the modern ones alike, had access to intelligent people, to records, to history, to advisors. The Chongzhen court was not staffed by fools, and neither is any modern treasury. So how does the same blindness keep happening to people who are not blind? And the answer, I think, is the most quietly terrifying thing in this entire story, more than the cannibalism in the gazetteers, more than the emperor on the hill, because it is a flaw not in any particular government, but in the act of governing itself. Here is the flaw. You can measure what you cut. You cannot measure what you destroy. The 685,000 taels the Ming saved were countable. They appeared in Lu Mao's report. They could be totaled, presented, defended, rewarded. They were a number, and numbers are what bureaucracies can see. But the thing the cut actually destroyed, the connective tissue of the empire, the slender threads holding a dying frontier to a living center. The difference between a desperate man with a grievance and a desperate man with a horse and a knowledge of every road in the realm, none of that appeared on any ledger anywhere. There was no line item called social cohesion of the Northwest. There was no account labeled the dynasty's continued existence. Those things were real. They were arguably the most valuable assets the state possessed, and they were completely invisible to the only instrument the state had for deciding what to do, which was the budget. The state could see the savings with perfect clarity and could not see the cost at all, not because the cost was small, but because the cost was the kind of thing that does not have a number until it is too late to do anything but count the bodies. This is the deep structure of the abdication I told you to watch for all the way back at the start. The officials did not fail to care. Many of them cared enormously. They failed to perceive, and they failed to perceive because the tools of governance are tools for managing the measurable, and the measurable is a thin and treacherous slice of the real. When you give a frightened institution a ledger and a crisis, it will optimize the ledger, because the ledger is the only part of the crisis it can actually grip. It will cut the thing with the visible cost and preserve the thing with the invisible cost every single time, and it will feel responsible doing it, because responsibility inside a bureaucracy means improving the numbers you can see. The modern American efficiency drive could measure the salaries it eliminated. It could not measure, until the failures started showing up months later, the tax returns that would go unprocessed, the benefits that would be delayed, the inspections that would not happen, the slow erosion of state capacity that one organization warned might take decades to repair. The savings were a number on day one. The destruction was a fog that would not resolve into numbers until long after the decision was celebrated as a success. And this is why knowing the history does not save you, which is the cruelest part. You could hand every official in every one of those 4 capitals a perfect account of the fall of the Ming, and most of them would read it and nod and agree it was a tragedy, and then return to their own budget and make the same choice, because their budget would still show them only the measurable savings and would still hide from them the load-bearing thing they were about to cut. They would not see themselves in the story. They would see the Chongzhen court as the fools who cut the wrong thing, and themselves as the wise ones who are cutting the right thing, and they would have no instrument capable of telling them which one they actually were. The lesson of the Ming is not a lesson you can simply apply, because the thing that makes the trap lethal is precisely that it is invisible from the only vantage point you are standing on when you fall into it. I keep coming back to that feeling, the feeling of grim responsibility, because I have become convinced it is the single most important warning sign and the one nobody heeds, because it feels like the opposite of a warning sign. When a government announces austerity into a fragile economy, listen to the language and listen to the mood. Listen for the words responsible, disciplined, difficult but necessary, the adult choice, finally making the hard decisions. Listen for the tone of sober courage, the self-congratulation of people who believe they are doing the unpopular but correct thing. And then notice the relief in the commentary, the relief in the markets, the relief of a public that has been told its government is finally getting serious. That relief is the most dangerous moment, because the relief is the feeling of the trap closing. The Chongzhen court felt that relief in 1629, when the savings were tallied and the responsible thing had been done. The exact texture of that relief, the sense that someone is finally being a grown-up about the money, is the sensation that a fragile system produces right before the cut that finishes it. It is being produced right now. It is in the air of at least 4 capitals as you listen to this. And the people feeling it are certain, the way the Chongzhen court was certain, that it is the feeling of being saved, and you are not standing outside this. I want to turn the whole thing toward you now, because the temptation, listening to a story like this, is to file it under history, under foreign places, under things that happen to other people in other times, and that filing is itself a kind of blindness. The same blindness that let the Chongzhen court read about the failures of earlier dynasties and feel safe. You live in one of these economies, or in one very much like them. You have already, in your adult life, watched a government you live under face a moment of fiscal fear and reach for the cut. You have heard the language of responsibility deployed over it. You may even have felt the relief yourself, the reasonable civic relief of thinking that the people in charge were finally being serious about the money. And you had no way, in that moment, to know which kind of cut you were watching, the kind that buys back confidence, or the kind that pulls a thread out of something already coming apart. None of us do. We are all inside the room. We are all looking at the same red ink that means two opposite things, feeling the same relief that precedes salvation and the same relief that precedes collapse, unable to tell them apart, because they cannot be told apart from the inside until the outcome arrives and decides retroactively which story we were living in all along. Think about the courier one more time, because I have been carrying him with me through this whole thing, and I want to hand him to you before we finish. Picture an ordinary man at one of those relay stations in the dry hills of Shaanxi, sometime around 1629. He is not a rebel. He is not a king. He is a low-level state employee with a job that consists of keeping the empire's messages moving, of having a fresh horse ready when the courier comes through, of being one tiny functioning cell in the vast nervous system of a continental state. He has a family. He has a wage, paid in silver, in a region where silver has nearly disappeared, which makes that wage one of the few solid things left in his collapsing world. And one day word comes down from the capital, from men he will never meet, in a palace he will never see, that his station is being closed. The number has been run. The savings have been calculated. His livelihood is, on a ledger he has never laid eyes on, a cost that has been optimized away. He walks out of the station into a province where the rain has stopped and the grain is gone and the dead are in the fields, and he is now one more hungry man who knows every road in the empire. That man is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and notice what he represents, because it is the ironic heart of all of this. He was infrastructure. He was the thing the state built to hold itself together, the connective tissue, the means by which the center stayed in contact with the edge. The state created him to be a source of its own coherence, and the moment the state, in a spasm of responsible economy, severed him from itself, he did not simply vanish from the equation the way the ledger assumed he would. He carried his knowledge and his skills and his fury out the door with him, and he reassembled, with tens of thousands like him, into the precise instrument of the state's destruction. The empire's own nervous system, cut loose, became the empire's executioner, and the people who cut it felt, the whole time, like they were trimming fat. This is the thing I genuinely cannot stop turning over. The most dangerous thing a fragile system can do is mistake its own load-bearing structure for waste, and a fragile system is exactly the kind of system most likely to make that mistake. Because fear narrows vision down to the ledger, and the ledger cannot see what is holding the building up. It can only see what the building costs. So here is where we have arrived, and I am not going to soften the landing, because softening it would betray everything the evidence actually says. Austerity during fragility is not a mistake that smart people avoid. It is the default reflex of frightened systems. It crosses every ideology and every century. It feels like responsibility from the inside. It produces a clean savings figure that is almost always trivial against the real problem, and it removes support from exactly the people and the structures that are holding the system together at exactly the moment they are least able to withstand the removal. The people who do it are not stupid and not evil. They are doing the adult thing. And the adult thing, applied to a crisis of the real, applied to a system already coming apart under physical load, is the killing thing. The relief everyone feels when it is announced is not the feeling of being saved. It is the feeling of the trap closing, mistaken, every time, for the feeling of the trap opening. and somewhere, in at least 4 capital cities, on a ledger somewhere, a number is being run, and a piece of connective tissue is being identified as a cost, and a memo is being drafted that everyone in the room agrees is the responsible thing to do. But I have to take one more thing away from you, because I have left you with a small comfort, and it is a false one, and you deserve to have it removed. The comfort is this: if austerity during fragility is the killing move, then the lesson seems clear and almost hopeful. Do not cut. Hold the line. Protect the load-bearing things. Spend through the crisis. The Ming should simply have kept the relay system running, and the dynasty might have survived. And if that is true, then the trap is avoidable, and all you need is the wisdom to not cut. And we can all walk away from this story a little wiser and a little safer. I do not believe that comfort survives contact with the actual situation, and I think the truth underneath it is much worse. Here is the strongest possible case for what the Chongzhen court did, and I am going to make it as well as I can, because if I only give you the prosecution, I am doing the thing I accused the lazy storytellers of doing. The relay system genuinely was corrupt. It genuinely was being abused, drained by officials using it as a private convenience, riddled with waste. A real and documented problem that real reformers had been complaining about, for good reasons. The treasury genuinely was empty, and not because of fecklessness, but because of a war against the Manchus that could not be abandoned without losing the north. A war that was consuming the silver as fast as it could be raised. The emperor genuinely was being told by serious officials that savings had to be found somewhere, that the money simply was not there, that the state could not continue spending at the current rate and survive. And in that situation, with a real deficit and a real war and a real abused program sitting right there, what exactly was the responsible alternative? Print more debased coin and accelerate the monetary chaos. Raise the surtaxes on the peasantry even higher and accelerate the very rebellions you are trying to fund the war against. Abandon the northern frontier and let the Manchus in years earlier than they came. Every option on the table was a path to catastrophe. Every single one. That is the thing I cannot get out from under, and it is the real lesson, the one that is genuinely hard to live with. By the time a system reaches a certain degree of fragility, it may no longer possess a single safe move. Not one. Every lever it can pull accelerates some version of the collapse. The cut kills it one way, the failure to cut kills it another way, the surtax kills it a third way, the inflation a fourth. Fragility, at its deepest, is not a problem you solve with the correct decision. Fragility is the condition of having run out of correct decisions. It is the disappearance of the safe option from the menu entirely, while the menu still looks, from the inside, like it contains choices. The Chongzhen court was not choosing between a good move and a bad move and picking the bad one out of stupidity. It may well have been choosing among several bad moves, all of which led to some form of the end, and the cut they chose was simply the one whose catastrophe took 15 years to arrive instead of 2. That is not a failure of wisdom so much as a position from which wisdom has already been removed as an option. And the truly disturbing implication, the one I want you to carry, is that a system can pass into that condition without anyone noticing, can cross the line from having safe moves to having none, and the crossing leaves no mark, sends no signal, appears on no ledger. You only discover that the safe options are gone by reaching for one and finding it is not there. And this is the version of the trap that applies most sharply to the modern cases, because the modern fragile states are caught in a structure that removes their safe options on purpose. A country like Nigeria or Kenya, carrying heavy debt, dependent on international lenders, does not get to simply decide to spend through its crisis and protect its load-bearing institutions. The lenders will not allow it. The price of continued access to credit, the price of not being cut off from the financial system entirely, is fiscal consolidation, is the subsidy removal, is the finance bill, is the discipline. The International Monetary Fund expresses its regret over the dead in the streets of Nairobi and then explains that the consolidation must nonetheless continue, and it is not being cynical when it says this. It is describing a real constraint, because the alternative it is weighing is a default and a financial collapse that might be worse still. The fragile state is told to make the cut by a global system that holds its survival hostage to the cut, and so it makes the cut into its own fragility, into its own desperate population. And when the population breaks and the blood runs, everyone involved can correctly say that they had no choice, that every other option was also catastrophic, that they were doing the only responsible thing available. The trap does not require villains. It only requires fragility and a ledger and the absence, by the time anyone looks, of a single safe move. The thing I keep wanting to do and keep stopping myself from doing is to tell you which of the four is the Ming and which is the Argentina. To point at one of those capitals and say, that one, that is the one walking off the cliff, and that other one, that one is going to be fine. I cannot do it. Not because I lack opinions, but because the honest answer is that nobody can do it from here, from inside the moment, and anyone who tells you they can is selling you the same false certainty that the Chongzhen court sold itself. We will find out which was which the way we always find out, which is afterward, in retrospect, when the outcomes have arrived and frozen into history, and some later narrator can stand where I am standing now and walk through the budget decisions of the 2020s with a terrible clarity of hindsight. That narrator will know. That narrator will be able to say, with the same confidence I have when I describe Lu Mao's memo, that this cut here, in this capital, in this year, was the hinge, the moment the safe options ran out, the responsible decision that turned out to be the fatal one. And the people in the room when that decision was made will not have known, any more than the Ming officials knew, any more than you know about the decisions being made over your own life right now. Because that is the position we are actually in, all of us, and it is worth saying plainly. We are not the readers of this story. We are the gazetteer. We are the entry that some future historian will read. The budget decisions being made in Washington and Buenos Aires and Paris and Abuja as you listen to this are, right now, the raw material of a narrative that has not been written yet, that cannot be written yet, because its ending has not happened. Some of those decisions are the Argentina kind and will be remembered as the bitter medicine that worked. Some of them are the Ming kind and will be remembered as the moment a system reached for the ledger and amputated the thing that was holding it together. And the unbearable fact, the thing that I find genuinely difficult to sit with, is that they look identical right now. The wise cut and the fatal cut are wearing the same clothes, using the same words, producing the same clean savings figures, generating the same civic relief, and they will go on being indistinguishable until the day, years from now, when one of them produces a recovery and the other produces a man walking out of a relay station into a dying province with the knowledge of every road in the empire. I told you at the beginning that the question was why a government facing a crisis it can see coming keeps reaching for the response that makes the crisis worse, and why that response feels like wisdom. And we have the answer now, and it is not a comfortable one, and I am not going to make it comfortable. It reaches for the cut, because the cut is the only part of the crisis it can grip. It feels like wisdom because, from inside a frightened bureaucracy, improving the number you can see is the entire definition of wisdom, and the number you can see is the savings. And the thing you cannot see is everything that matters. It keeps happening across every ideology and every century, because it is not a choice anyone is really making. It is a reflex that fragile systems perform. And the people performing it experience the reflex as their own considered judgment right up until the consequence arrives. And it cannot be cured by knowing about it, because the knowledge does not give you the one thing you would need, which is the ability to see from the inside, in the moment, which kind of cut you are about to make. That instrument does not exist. It has never existed. The Ming did not have it, and we do not have it. And the budgets are being drafted anyway, in rooms where everyone agrees that the responsible thing is finally being done. And I have not yet told you the full size of the thing, because I wanted you to understand the mechanism before I showed you the body count. And the body count is the part that should make you angriest of all, not at any individual, but at the silence around it. The fall of the Ming and the conquest that followed were not a tidy dynastic handover. They were one of the deadliest convulsions in the entire history of the human species. The rebellions Li Zicheng was part of were not the only ones. In the southwest, in Sichuan, another rebel named Zhang Xiansong carved out his own reign of slaughter. And the accounts of what happened to the population of Sichuan in those years describe a depopulation so total that the province had to be resettled afterward from elsewhere. Across the whole catastrophe, the famine and the plague and the rebellions and the conquest together, the estimates of how many human beings died run into the tens of millions, and some scholars, looking at the broader collapse and the population decline across the 17th century, have put the toll at 1/4 of everyone alive in China at the time. The numbers are contested and the ranges are wide, and I will not pretend to a precision the sources do not support. But even the most conservative honest reading describes a die-off on a scale that belongs in the same sentence as the worst things our species has ever done or suffered, and almost nobody outside of China has ever heard of it. There is no widely known name for it in the Western imagination, no place in the standard story of the 17th century. A century that Western history remembers for its own wars and revolutions, while a catastrophe that killed more people than all of them combined unfolded on the other side of the world and left barely a mark on the popular memory of the West. This is the part that genuinely does feel like a scandal to me, in the plain sense of the word. One of the largest mass deaths in recorded history, set in motion by a convergence of climate and money and policy, with a budget cut sitting close to the center of the mechanism, and it occupies almost no space in the way most of us are taught to think about the past. The relay couriers, the dry rivers, the cannibalism in the gazetteers, the emperor on the hill, the tens of millions of dead. It is all just sitting there in the record, fully documented, waiting. And the lesson it contains about what fragile states do to themselves is one we are in the middle of needing very badly, and we walk past it as if it were nothing. So let me leave you where this started, on a hill and at a relay station, because the two images belong together, and I think they say the thing better than any argument can. The relay station first. It is empty now. It has been empty since the order came down, the responsible order, the one that saved 685,000 taels and balanced a line in a ledger that was drowning in red ink no line could fix. The horses are gone. The beds are gone. The men who worked there have scattered into a province where the rain has stopped. The building is still standing, for now. The road it sat on is still there, running off toward the next station, and the one after that, the whole severed length of the empire's nervous system lying inert across the dry hills, a network built over centuries to carry the messages that held a continent together, now carrying nothing. The road did not disappear when the funding did. That is the part the ledger never understood. You can stop paying for the thing, and the thing does not politely cease to exist. It just stops doing what it did for you and waits to be used for something else, by someone else, for reasons of their own. And the hill, Coal Hill, behind the palace in the spring of 1644. The emperor is climbing it in the grey light with the rebel army already inside his city, and he understands, finally, far too late to matter, that the catastrophe fell hardest on the innocent, and that his own people were never the enemy. What he does not understand, what he goes to the tree still not understanding, is that one of the threads that brought him here was pulled 15 years earlier by his own government, in a moment that felt like nothing, that felt like prudence, that felt like the adult choice. He is about to die believing he failed through weakness. He also failed through a kind of competence. He balanced what he could measure while the unmeasured ground gave way beneath him, and the measuring felt, the entire time, like governing. Here is what I want you to carry out of this, and it is not a comfort, and I am not going to dress it up as one. The collapse does not announce itself. It does not arrive wearing the face of catastrophe. It arrives wearing the face of responsibility. It arrives as a sensible cut to a wasteful program, as a difficult but necessary measure, as a government finally getting serious about the money, and it generates, on its way in, a wave of relief that everyone mistakes for the feeling of being saved. The fatal decision and the wise decision are wearing the same clothes. They produce the same clean number. They generate the same civic relief. And there is no instrument, none, that lets you tell them apart from the inside, in the moment, before the outcome arrives, to decide retroactively which one you were living through all along. The Chongzhen court did not have that instrument. The four capitals do not have it now. You do not have it. Nobody has ever had it. We like to imagine that we would see it coming, that if we were in the room watching a fragile state reach for the cut that would end it, we would stand up and say something, because surely it would be obvious. It would not be obvious. It has never once been obvious to the people in the room. It was not obvious to intelligent, sincere, responsible administrators at the head of the largest empire on earth. And it is not obvious to the intelligent, sincere, responsible people drafting the budgets you live under right now. The thing that makes the trap lethal is the same thing that makes it invisible, which is that falling into it feels exactly like doing your job well. The relay courier walked out of his station into a dying province with the knowledge of every road in the empire, and the empire that dismissed him felt the whole time like it was trimming fat. Somewhere right now a number is being run. A program is being identified as a cost. A memo is being drafted that everyone in the room agrees is the responsible thing to do. And the relief they feel as they sign it is the same relief the Chongzhen court felt in 1629. The road is still there. The mail has stopped moving. And somewhere a man who used to carry it is walking toward a capital that thinks it just balanced its books.